Stargate, a novel by Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich. Chapter 5, Decoding Creek Mountain. Swerving along a twisting two-lane highway deep in the Colorado Rockies, Daniel, never a very good driver, felt it was necessary to check his road map every time he was headed into a turn. As if this weren't dangerous enough, he was sneezing constantly. Over his right shoulder, the back seat was awash with moist tissue paper. Then, at long last, after 4 full days on the road for a trip that should have taken 36 hours, he saw the sign, Creek Mountain, U.S. Government Special Zone. He turned the oil-burning, steam-hissing muscle car, a black '68 Dodge Charger, with a tape of Elvis's greatest hits permanently lodged in the 8-track player, off the highway and up the steep, tree-lined entrance road. When he saw the soldiers at the gate, he was so relieved he honked his horn and waved. Pulling up to the checkpoint, he encountered a pair of not very amused Marines, hands on holsters. One of them stepped out of the kiosk and approached the car. "I'm Daniel Jackson," he said, as if the men at the gate should have been expecting him. "I didn't think I was going to make it." "Your credentials?" Daniel made a violent grab for something on the seat, and before the Marines could draw their weapons, he sneezed into it, then tossed it over his shoulder. He handed the stack of papers Catherine had given him over to the guard, who studied them carefully. Daniel sneezed again. "You got quite a cold there, Dr. Jackson," observed the soldier, inspecting the vehicle's littered interior. "Uh-huh, allergies," Daniel told him. "Always happens when I travel." When they raised the gate and waved him through, Daniel coaxed the Dodge up one last hill and then out into the clearing, where he expected to find all the Quonset huts, jeeps, and heavy artillery he associated with the word military base. Instead, he found 24 civilian automobiles parked near the mouth of a large cave cut into the side of the mountain. The only indication that this was indeed a military installation was a group of Marines doing calisthenics in a clearing between the pine trees. Daniel found a parking spot and turned off the key. The engine continued to chug as he got out of the car and opened the trunk. It finally died with a loud backfire. The big soldier who had been leading the exercise drill jogged up behind Daniel as he was struggling to lift his enormous book bag out of the trunk. "Daniel Jackson?" the sweaty soldier inquired, but before the road-weary archaeologist could answer, this muscular soldier had grabbed his hand and was shaking it eagerly. "I'm Kowalski, Lieutenant Colonel Adam Kowalski. Where have you been? Dr. Langford thought you changed your mind." "I decided to drive. Took me longer than I expected." The man was 6 foot 4 inches, dripping with sweat, and being entirely too friendly for Daniel's taste. "So, is this an army base?" "I'm not authorized to discuss that." The soldier read him the textbook response. Daniel had to grin. "No, seriously, is this like a camp for army scholars, a think tank or something?" "I don't know what kind of security clearance you have, sir, and until I do, I can't discuss that subject." Giving the soldier a look that said, "Whatever," Daniel returned to the project of extracting his books from the trunk, now with the additional problem of somebody watching him. "Help you with that?" volunteered Kowalski, stepping in. Daniel tried to warn him. "Careful, they're books, and they're really—" Kowalski hoisted the bag with one hand and slammed the trunk shut with the other. Heavy. Daniel, no wimp, was somewhat alarmed by the ease that Kowalski was able to lift the literary load. Following the soldier toward the tunnel entrance, he thought he must be one of the strongest men in the world. They walked through a pair of giant concrete doors and into a dark, cavernous hall. When his eyes adjusted to the light, Daniel saw they were in a very large room with a polished concrete floor. Strangely, the only things in the room were a small drab shack made of corrugated tin and a guard's kiosk next to it. Kowalski signaled to the guard without breaking stride, and the doors of the little shack swung open automatically. Daniel followed him into the small structure. We call this thing the telephone booth, Kowalski explained. Like on Get Smart? Daniel had no idea what that meant, even when the room around them shuddered and then began to sink. The small room was actually an elevator, one that was descending at a brisk clip. It seemed to Daniel that it was a long way between floors. He watched the numbers go by. 5, 6, 7. Kowalski, used to it, offered his guest a stick of gum. Equalizes your ear pressure. Daniel took the gum and chewed nervously. 13, 14, 15. What floor are we headed for? Kowalski, stone-faced. That's classified information, sir. This time Daniel knew it was a joke, but didn't think it was funny. 21, 22, 23. Daniel started to say something else, but the elevator stopped in front of the number 28. The doors opened onto a hallway as sterile as you'd find in any hospital. Daniel followed the lieutenant through the buzz of neon light bulbs, past closed office doors, and around several corners, moving deeper into the antiseptic subterranean maze until Kowalski suddenly stopped and knocked on one of the doors. Dr. Myers, are you in there, sir? The door cracked open, and out came the shiny head of a middle-aged man with bulging eyes. He squinted at Daniel through the bifocals before saying, You must be the fresh meat. He came out into the hallway with a dyspeptic expression on his face. It's Jackson, isn't it? I'm Dr. Gary Myers, Ph.D., on loan from Harvard. His pompous manner made it easy to dislike Dr. Myers, and Daniel started getting the idea of it right away. Daniel had heard of him, of course. Being a professor at a school like Harvard meant sitting on powerful advisory boards, having your articles published in the most respected journals, and enjoying all the benefits of being part of the academic establishment. On the one hand, Daniel could care less about Myers. He was one of those elite ivory tower professors who hadn't done a stitch of original thinking in years. On the other hand, he knew that without their help, he would never get the grant money and support staff to move ahead with his own career. Furthermore, although he would never admit it, he longed for his approval. Where the hell am I? Daniel wondered aloud. A goddamn nuclear missile silo, twanged a woman's voice behind them. Dr. Shore, Kowalski turned on his heels. Until Dr. Jackson gets a security classification, we are not... Oh, shut up, Kowalski, you overgrown testicle, she snapped, somehow managing to make it sound flirtatious. Coming out of her office on the other side of the hall was a woman about 40 years old, short, stacked, and aggressively sexy. She was the kind of creature you'd least expect to find working in an underground military bunker. Prowling straight toward Daniel, she explained in a Texas drawl. Don't worry, darling. The place has been completely converted. But technically it's still a military installation, so these jawheads get to act like they own the place. Daniel smiled. He knew he liked this woman. Anyway, hi, I'm Barbara Shaw, the token astrophysicist on the program. Her eyeshadow matched the dark blue of her tight jumpsuit, making her look like a dame you might meet in a bowling alley. They shook hands and made small talk for a minute before she turned to Kowalski. Lieutenant, let's show this nice man to his new office, and you be nice to him, or you can forget about that back rub I promised you. In spite of her venomous tone, it was clear she liked the big soldier. Kowalski, holding back a smile, turned and led the group down the hall to a door marked 2842. He pushed the door open and said, This is where you'll be working. Daniel couldn't believe his eyes. The office was the size of a small warehouse. The walls, over 20 feet high, were covered with large charcoal rubbings and photographic enlargements of hieroglyphics. On the long work table, a slew of computer equipment was hooked up and online. 2 smaller tables held various artifacts, and the bookshelf was stocked with every conceivable volume on the subject of hieroglyphic interpretation, including photocopies of everything Daniel had published on the subject. There was even a portable stereo, a coffee machine, and a small refrigerator. But it was the wall directly across from the work table that caught and held Daniel's attention. Something round and huge was fixed to the wall, floor to ceiling, and covered with a parachute-sized sheet. Daniel figured it must be the stone tablet, the cover stone Catherine had showed him in the snapshots. He pulled the cloth to the floor, revealing the strange treasure found at Giza all those years ago. This was the moment he'd driven all the way from L.A. for, and it did not disappoint. Amazed and delighted, he stood there gaping at the ancient stone. In the meantime, Catherine Langford came to the door, nodded hello to the others, and entered the room. In her own sweet time, she let Daniel know she was there. "Glad you could join us." Daniel turned and looked at her. His lips moved as if to speak, but nothing came out. He looked back at the giant monolith once more before asking her the obvious question. "Where did you find this thing?" "The Giza Plateau in 1928, she explained, coming up behind him. "You can see that there are 2 rings of hieroglyphs. With Dr. Meyer's help, we've been able to translate the inner track of writing, which is an extremely early form of hieroglyph, but the outer one has been giving us fits. The symbols, as you can see, are unlike any ever found." Catherine let him absorb the information and then dangled the bait in front of him. "Although we've showed these signs to a number of experts, including a few of the people who walked out on your talk the other day, no one has been able to make heads or tails of them. Like Champollion with the Rosetta Stone, we thought the 2 scripts might be parallel translations, but if they are, we can't find the similarities. It doesn't help that it's written in a circle without any discernible punctuation." While Dr. Myers started into a long-winded explanation of the various decoding programs they had used, Daniel's attention wandered to a translation written on a portable blackboard near the stone. He listened with one ear for a while, but finally interrupted. "This is all wrong." Moving to the blackboard, he wiped away the word time and replaced it with the word years. "I beg your pardon," puffed Myers, moving to protect his translation. He looked to Catherine for support, but she gestured for him to back off, which he reluctantly did. Daniel was completely comfortable with the hieroglyphs. Over the last 3 years, he had become virtually fluent in this dead language, the precursor of the writing system used by the pharaohs. Although many of the symbols remained the same, the grammar was radically different. There were probably less than 10 people in the world who could read these early symbols. Daniel mistakenly assumed that Dr. Myers was one of them, and spoke to his eminent colleague over his shoulder as he worked. "You used Budge, didn't you? Why do they keep reprinting his books?" Erasing and rewriting at incredible speed, Daniel fell into a hypnotic rhythm as he tried to capture not only the literal meaning, but the felling sense of the script. Then he stopped, puzzled. "Now this is curious," he said to no one in particular. "The word kebe is followed by an adverbial sedyemen f with a cleft subject." He turned slowly to Myers and asked, "In his sarcophagus?" Daniel scrunched up his face like the indelicacy of the translation was causing him physical pain. "I don't think so," he said condescendingly. "I think sealed and buried is a little more accurate." As Daniel continued to work, the other people in the room exchanged incredulous glances. They'd all watched Myers, whose degrees and academic awards were conspicuously framed on his office walls, labor for weeks to translate the message. Daniel's speed was incredible. Within minutes he had finished and backed away from the board, moving to the stones. He offered his audience a play-by-play, or glyph-by-glyph as it were, reading of the ancient message. Beginning here it reads, "A million years into the sky is Ra, sun god, sealed and buried for all time his..." Moving back to the board, he used the eraser like the sword of Zorro to dispatch the last words of Myers' translation. "Not door to heaven. The proper translation is Stargate." Then he read the message once more. Everybody stared at Daniel, stunned by this awesome display of skill. Dr. Shore tiptoed up behind Myers, whispered something in his ears, and patted him on the fanny. "All right," Daniel wanted to maintain his momentum. "Will somebody please tell me why the military has an astrophysicist working with an archaeologist in a nuclear missile silo studying Egyptian tablets that are 5,000 years old?" My report says 10,000. In the doorway was a spit-and-polished soldier, Colonel Jack O'Neill, clean-shaven and sporting a boot camp-style haircut. He was a man who had undergone a complete and radical transformation. The expression in his eyes was no longer one of being controlled by his ghosts. It was an expression of self-assurance and command. Kowalski, spotting the Silver Eagle insignia on O'Neill's uniform, snapped to attention. "Sir!" "At ease." Opening his black folder, O'Neill removed a document and handed it over to Kowalski for his inspection. There was nothing outwardly unusual about this man, but nonetheless he was frightening. He conveyed irreconcilable opposites to the scientists in the room. At the same time that he seemed as calm as the dead, he looked coiled and ready to strike. The mood in the office, even before Kowalski handed back the document, had turned black, like finding a rattlesnake midway through an Easter egg hunt. "Catherine Langford, my name is O'Neill. Colonel Jack O'Neill from General West's office. I'll be taking over from this point forward." Catherine, not sure what to make of this, turned to Kowalski, who looked up from the document more stunned than anyone, and nodded. Daniel hadn't heard anything after the words 10,000 years. As Catherine and the others began to pepper O'Neill with questions, he interrupted them all. "Wait a second. 10,000 years? I'm sorry, but that's impossible. Egyptian civilization didn't even exist until... Actually," Dr. Myers saw his opportunity to tell Daniel something he didn't know. "The sonic and radiocarbon C-14 tests are conclusive." Myers pointed to the tables that held the Langford's expedition's incidental finds, a collection of tool fragments and pottery shards. "These artifacts from associated and overlying strata have been tested to the same era. Besides," and how he was getting downright snotty, "they're clearly Epipaleolithic or Neolithic, probably related to the Natufian in Palestine, which makes them at least that old." Daniel, milking them for information, tried a different approach. "These are cover stones. There must have been a tomb underneath." "Something more interesting than a bunch of bones, darling," Shore began to explain before she was cut off by O'Neill, who stepped between them. "Excuse me, Dr. Shore, but that information has become classified." "Oh, come on, Colonel," purred the astrophysicist. "He's part of the team." O'Neill stared back at her like a thresher stares at wheat. When she saw that flirting was getting her nowhere, she appealed to her boss. "Catherine, what in the hell is going on here?" Catherine gestured for everyone to remain calm. Over her many years on the project, she'd weathered so many storms and endured so many major setbacks that she knew how to take this one in stride. Besides, she had developed the skill of compromising her way to exactly what she wanted. All the same, she had a bad feeling about O'Neill and the way General West had sent him here without warning. She guessed it must have something to do with Daniel being brought in. "Effective immediately," O'Neill announced. "No information is to be passed on to non-military personnel without my written permission." Daniel, non-military personnel if ever there was such a creature, asked the colonel if he was kidding. "I just drove here all the way from L.A. What exactly is it you want me to do here?" O'Neill, as smooth as a razor blade, answered, "You're a translator. To translate." Then he turned to Kowalski. "Lieutenant, I want all information not directly pertaining to these tablets to be removed from this workspace and brought to my office immediately. Until that happens, you are the only individual authorized to be in this room." With that, he turned and started out of the office. Kowalski, not quite sure, called out to him, "Your office, sir?" O'Neill, already in the doorway, looked back over his shoulder. "And I'll need an office." "Yes, sir." Before he could get out of earshot, Shore called out, "Who was that masked man?" She made sure to say it loud enough for O'Neill to hear. Catherine was already on the move. She took off out the door, chasing after O'Neill. That left Kowalski and the rest of the scientific team staring at each other. He was hoping they would cooperate with the orders because he was in no mood to enforce them. Daniel, still wanting to believe he had somehow misunderstood. "You guys can't be serious about restricting me from information." he said to Kowalski. "I mean, if I'm going to have any chance of figuring out what this stone says, I'm going to need information. Otherwise, what the hell am I doing here?" Kowalski didn't like this situation any more than Daniel did. What more could he add? They'd all heard his orders, delivered in no uncertain terms. Inwardly, he was dying. West had taken command of the project away from him after almost 3 years, just when they were getting close. Adding salt to the wound, his replacement was this strange O'Neill character who the documents told him had come out of retirement to take the job. "Your quarters are over there, directly across the hall. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." "Didn't you hear what I just said?" Daniel was about to explode. His life was a big enough mess without this high-handed military nonsense. "How am I supposed to decipher this thing without any information?" Kowalski had no use for being yelled at. He was the sort of guy who would treat you just as well as you treated him, and this was the wrong moment to jump on his case. "I have my orders," he said in a monotone. He pointed toward the door, the expansion on his face giving Daniel and the others every incentive to use it. Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Do you always follow orders? Always?" "As a matter of fact, I do." "Colonel, just a minute." Out in the hallway, Catherine caught up with O'Neill. "I think you owe me some kind of explanation. I have been personally assured by General West that I would have complete autonomy." "Plans change," he shrugged. "Apparently," Catherine said patiently, "but I'd appreciate some elaboration." O'Neill tried to finesse her. "The way I understand it, the folks at headquarters feel things have gotten a little too loose around here, and now you've brought in another civilian." "Colonel O'Neill," her tone made it clear that she wasn't buying that story, "Jackson was approved." O'Neill didn't want to lie, so he kept quiet. Catherine sensed as much and asked him point blank, "This doesn't have anything to do with him, does it? What's this all about? Why'd they bring you in?" The colonel thought about all the answers he could give her. After West had read the file on Daniel, he guessed this was their best shot and decided it was time to roll in his heavy guns. Something about Catherine made O'Neill decide to tell her the truth. "I'm here in case you succeed,"